6 warships were already waiting in the dark before the first handshake was ever offered. The station bore the name Quelrath. In the old tongue of the Selvari people, it carried the meaning of the between place. It hung in the void separating 2 star systems the way a held breath hung between an inhale and an exhale. It belonged to neither side. No flag had ever been planted on its hull. No territorial marker had ever been logged against its coordinates. That precise neutrality was the reason the Assembly had selected it for the opening of first contact. For 3 weeks, the announcement had been broadcast across every frequency the Interstellar Accord maintained. Schools had played it for their youngest students. Historians had begun composing chapters they had not yet found endings for. 2 orders of spiritual practice on the Selvari home world had declared the week sacred. Lauren was none of those things. Not a politician, not a holy person, not a historian. He was the delegation xenobiologist assigned to observe and document and report back to the Assembly what he witnessed. He stood at the observation port of Docking Bay 7 and watched the human vessel ease into approach. It was smaller than he had anticipated. He had read the assessment briefs twice. He knew the registered displacement figure the crew manifest the diplomatic designation. Civilian transport, medical-grade life support systems, cultural delegation vessel, every marking in the correct position, every registration filed correctly. But the ship moved in a way that did not match those categories. Not poorly. Nothing you could isolate and identify by name. It simply moved the way a person moved when they were making a deliberate effort to appear at ease. There was an economy to its thruster corrections that did not belong on a vessel with a civilian classification. Every adjustment was minimal. Every approach angle landed exactly where it needed to land. The pilot was extraordinarily skilled. A highly skilled pilot aboard a cultural delegation ship was a small detail to notice. Lauren noticed it. He opened his field notebook and wrote one line. The pilot has received military-level training or its equivalent. Then he drew a line through it. He was being too cautious with his instincts. The Assembly had verified this ship through 3 independent channels. He closed the notebook and watched the docking arms extend and lock into place with a sound like a long breath finally released. The airlock cycled and the humans came through. There were 9 of them. The ambassador walked first. Her name was Marin Voss. She was dark-complexioned with silver at her temples and wore something deep navy that was formal without being stiff. Her posture was not the posture of someone who had learned to stand correctly. It was the posture of someone who had never needed to learn it. It simply lived in her skeleton. Behind her, the rest came through in pairs. 2 cultural specialists. A medical officer, a communications technician, 2 junior staff members, and 1 individual whose manifest entry listed the title of Operations Coordinator, but whose eyes moved through a room the way someone moved their eyes when they were counting exits. Lauren counted the exits in the docking bay. There were 3 of them. He looked at the Operations Coordinator. She had already found all 3 before he finished counting. The opening session was held in the station's central diplomatic chamber, which the Selvari team had spent 2 months preparing to be genuinely neutral territory. No Accord banners, no star charts marking territorial lines, only a long table and chairs calibrated for 2 different body types and a translation system the technical crew had tested 400 times. It functioned correctly on the 501st attempt during the actual session. Lauren would later think this was either fortunate timing or the universe exercising its sense of irony. Ambassador Voss sat across from Senior Delegate Oravan, who led the Selvari contingent. The first 20 minutes were what the session guide called exploratory exchange. Each side introduced itself. Names, roles, institutional structures, standard first contact protocol, careful measured formal language designed above all else to be safe. Then the human junior staff member set 3 wrapped packages on the table. This had not been in the protocol document. Oravan paused. The packages were wrapped in folded paper with ribbon tied across the top. Lauren had read about this practice in the cultural preparation files. Humans presented physical objects to mark occasions they considered significant. The practice was ancient, pre-industrial. It had survived every technological era the species had moved through. When Lauren considered that later, it told him something specific about what humans chose to preserve when everything else changed. The junior staff member was a young man with an open face and a translation earpiece he kept adjusting with one finger. He glanced briefly toward Ambassador Voss. She gave a single small nod, not directing, not encouraging, only confirming, "Go ahead." We were not certain what would be welcome. The young man said in clean accord, standard with an accent that was wrong in 3 places and correct in 7. But we thought something from home felt appropriate. Oravan looked at the packages and then at the young man and then at Ambassador Voss. Voss waited. She was exceptional at waiting. Oravan opened the first package. Inside was a small carved figure. An animal, 4-legged, long-necked, cut from dark wood with a craftsmanship that stopped several people at the table from speaking. The grain of the wood moved with the shape of the creature as if the animal had existed inside the material from the beginning, and the carver had only cleared the wood away to let it out. Nobody on the Selvari side of the table said anything for a moment. Then Lauren said, "What animal is this?" "A giraffe," said the young staff member. "They are very tall. They eat leaves from the tops of trees." He paused. "We are fond of them. I am not entirely sure why." The entire Selvari side of the table laughed. Lauren did not write anything. He was too occupied with laughing. The first 3 days were like that. Not every minute. There were long stretches of careful, slow translation work. Concepts that existed in one language and had no equivalent in the other. Misunderstandings that required 40 minutes to untangle and left everyone slightly tired on both sides. A 2-hour conversation about what the word sovereign meant when applied to empty space with no atmosphere, no surface, and no population that had ever existed there. But between those things, something else happened. The humans were funny, not performed funny, not the careful variety of humor deployed to put the other side at ease. The young staff member, whose name turned out to be Kai short for something longer that he said no one actually used, made a remark on the second day about the translation system that produced from senior delegate Oravan the Selvari equivalent of a genuine snort of laughter. The medical officer, a quiet woman named Calloway, had a habit of making extremely dry observations just below the volume of general conversation that Lauren's translation bead caught when no one else did. Twice, he had to direct his attention to the floor because he was laughing at the wrong moment. They were warm. That was the only word Lauren had for it. They occupied a room the way a fire occupied a room, not noisily, not by pressing outward, only by giving off heat without asking anything in return. When a Selvari junior delegate knocked her water vessel off the table and it rolled across the floor, 2 humans moved to retrieve it at the same instant. Then both stopped and laughed at each other for having done the same thing, and the junior delegate laughed with them. And for roughly 15 seconds, the diplomatic chamber sounded less like a first contact session and more like a room full of people who had known one another for years. Lauren liked them. He noticed that he liked them and wrote it in his notebook. "I like them. Note this." He had learned across 20 years of field research to record the things he liked. Liking something had a way of preventing you from seeing it clearly. The first genuine anomaly arrived on the afternoon of the second day. The station ran its standard monthly emergency drill, not in response to anything specific, simply the routine procedure that all stations conducted regardless of who was aboard. Alarms sounded for 30 seconds. The lighting shifted to amber. A recorded voice directed all non-essential personnel to proceed to designated muster points. The Selvari contingent moved, some faster than others. Oravan's aide nearly upended his chair. A junior cultural specialist who had never been posted to a station before froze for 1 second before a colleague touched his arm and guided him toward the corridor. Normal responses. The entirely reasonable small alarm that any sensible person experienced when a loud sound went off inside a pressurized structure surrounded by vacuum. The human delegation moved as well, but differently. Not faster, not with any visible urgency. They simply moved with a directional certainty that bore no resemblance to a drill response, without a word spoken between them, without any signal Lauren could identify. They separated into specific positions, one at the door, one near the wall panel, one positioned beside the senior delegate's chair. Kai, who made everyone laugh and adjusted his earpiece and talked about giraffes, had moved to stand between the Selvari junior delegates and the primary corridor entrance. And he was standing there the way a person stood when there was something behind them they were protecting and something in front of them they had not yet classified. Weight forward, back straight, eyes moving. 30 seconds later the alarm stopped. Lighting returned to normal. Everyone exhaled. The humans returned to their seats. Lauren sat completely still. He looked at Ambassador Voss. Her hands were folded on the table. They had been folded on the table the entire time, through the alarm, through the movement all around her, through 30 seconds during which every Selvari in the chamber had elevated pulse frills in the particular bioelectrical charge that accompanied genuine uncertainty about whether a situation was real. Her hands had not moved, not once, not one adjustment, not one tightening of the fingers, not one small tremor. He had observed negotiators with decades of training who still showed hand movement under sudden stress. It was automatic, physiological. Even those who had survived real emergencies showed it afterward. The body holding memory that the conscious mind had already moved past. Her hands had not moved. Lauren looked at her hands for a long time. Then he looked at his notebook and wrote, "Hand response absence during emergency drill. Second day. 14:22 hours. Delegate Voss. No visible stress response in peripheral motor control. Possible explanation extreme baseline calm. Possible explanation exceptional conditioning. Possible explanation something else." He looked at something else for a while. Then he wrote beneath it, "Operations Coordinator also." She identified the 3 exits before the drill alarm sounded. Not after. She already knew where they were. He underlined that last part. Then he put the notebook away and turned his attention back to the session. That evening, after the formal sessions ended and both delegations returned to their quarters, Lauren sat in his small office on the research level and opened the public access Human Cultural Archive. He told himself he was doing background reading, contextual material for his behavioral documentation. Routine work. He started with mythology. 3 hours later, he was still reading. Every major human civilization going back as far as their surviving record extended had war built into its stories. Not as a problem requiring solution. Not as a terrible episode that preceded better times. As a subject. Something to be examined and remembered and sung about and built monuments to and warned against and honored and mourned and returned to again and again across every form of human expression that had ever existed. Their oldest surviving poetry described a war. Their most widely distributed devotional texts contained wars, and the figures those texts held up as worthy and righteous were in a striking number of cases warriors. Not warriors by circumstance or misfortune, warriors by vocation, by something the texts treated as a category of virtue. Their children learned songs that, when run through the translation system without cultural softening, described battles, cheerful songs, songs children sang together in groups, and the visual art. Lauren spent an hour on the art alone, sculptures of soldiers, paintings of burning cities and vessels firing across open water and figures on horseback with weapons raised overhead, museums dedicated specifically to the objects and instruments of conflict, helmets, blades, uniforms, banners preserved under controlled atmospheric conditions and treated with the same careful reverence a Selvari temple gave its oldest texts. The humans kept these things. They went to look at them on their days off. He was not frightened. He told himself this firmly. He was a scientist and this was data, and he was not going to read conclusion into data before he had collected enough of it. He wrote in his notebook, "Human cultural archives saturated with conflict record across all historical periods and all expressive mediums. Unlike Accord, member species conflict is not represented as historical trauma requiring transcendence. It is represented as an ongoing subject requiring continued engagement. Observation only. Do not extrapolate. He looked at the word extrapolate for a long time. Then he closed the mythology section and opened the pre-contact diplomatic communication record, the public record available to all Accord researchers. He read 5 years of messages. The tone of every single human transmission was identical: warm, patient, cooperative. They had accepted every proposed neutral site without argument. They had agreed to every protocol adjustment the Accord requested. They had responded to every communication within 48 hours, which was faster than several Accord members responded to their own internal correspondence. They were easy to work with. Lauren sat with that for a while. He thought about things that were easy to work with. He thought about whether that was always reassuring. On the third day, there was a small incident. Nothing diplomatic, only physics. A water recycling valve in the secondary corridor failed, and for approximately 20 minutes, a fine mist drifted through the intersection near the human quarters before the maintenance crew arrived and sealed it. It was the variety of thing that was technically a problem and practically harmless. The kind of minor failure that left everyone damp and mildly irritated for a few minutes before it became a story to tell later. Lauren was passing through when it happened. He walked into the mist at the same moment Kai was coming from the other direction. They both stopped. They both looked at each other and then at the mist. "What is?" Lauren started. "Water recycling valve," Kai said. Not a guess. A statement of confirmed fact. He had already identified it. He looked up at the ceiling, found the valve housing, measured the angle of the mist distribution with his eyes, and shifted 2 steps to his left to the precise position that kept the spray off his collar. 2 seconds from identification to solution. Lauren stood in the mist and watched Kai find dry ground, and felt a feeling he did not yet write down. Kai looked at him. "You should step left." "I know," Lauren said. He stepped left. They stood together and waited for the maintenance crew, and Kai talked about giraffes for 15 minutes. By the end, Lauren knew more about giraffes than he had expected to know in his lifetime. He knew they were the tallest land animals on the human home world. He knew that a giraffe's heart was proportionally enormous, built to drive blood all the way up that extraordinary neck, and that despite this size they were by nature gentle animals, not combatants. He knew that humans found them beautiful in a way they struggled to articulate. He knew the carved figure on the table had taken the craftsman 3 weeks to complete. He was genuinely charmed, and he was genuinely unsettled by how thoroughly he was charmed, because the specific quality of charm was that it functioned whether or not it was deliberate. That night before sleep, Lauren wrote the final entry for the day. Day 3 complete. Cultural exchange proceeding well. Human delegation presents consistently as cooperative, warm, genuinely invested in positive relations. Behavioral anomalies noted in previous entries remain unexplained but not escalated. I find that I like them. I have already written this. I am writing it again because I want to continue noticing it. Noticing it is the work. Oravan said at dinner that this would be the least complicated first contact in Accord history. He said the humans were exactly what everyone hoped they would be. I do not know if that is a comfort. I keep thinking about her hands. I keep thinking about the operations coordinator and the 3 exits she found before any instruction was given. I keep thinking about the cultural archive and the old songs with their body counts that children sang cheerfully, and the museums full of preserved instruments of harm visited on leisure days. I think the warmth is real. I believe it is real. I have no evidence it is performed and every reason to think it is genuine. And also, and this is the part I cannot stop turning over, it is possible for something to be entirely real and still be in some way I cannot yet name. A choice. They are very easy to like. I keep wondering if they know that. He closed the notebook. Across the station in the human quarters, Ambassador Marin Voss sat at her small desk and composed a message on her encrypted personal channel. She read it once, changed one word, read it again, sent it. Then she folded her hands on the desk and looked at the wall. The message was 2 words long. Outside the station in the dark between the 2 star systems, the sensor arrays detected nothing unusual. Some fragments of ancient rock moving through the deep cold. Background radiation. The quiet of space being space. Nothing else. Nothing at all. The station's long-range arrays completed their standard sweep and found nothing and logged nothing and continued cycling. 3 decks below in the engineering section, a junior technician glanced at his monitoring board, saw a faint reading at the outermost edge of sensor range, blinked, looked again. It was gone. He logged it as instrument drift and went back to his coffee. On the 4th day, the humans brought food, not as a formal gesture, not as a diplomatic offering with presentation and ceremony. Kai simply appeared in the entrance of the research lounge at what humans described as lunchtime, carrying a sealed flat container and a small thermal regulator, and said, "We made too much. Are you hungry?" Lauren was hungry. He said yes before he finished deciding whether it was professionally appropriate to say yes. The food was warm and dense and introduced itself to a part of his palate that did not receive much use. He ate more than he planned to. The medical officer Calloway sat across from him. She asked him questions about Selvari digestive biology that were technically precise enough that Lauren suspected she had studied the xenobiology files before framing them as conversation. She presented them as casual inquiries. They were not casual inquiries, but the way she asked made answering feel natural. By the time the meal ended, Lauren had explained 3 aspects of Selvari biochemistry that did not appear in any public record. He understood this only afterward. In the moment, he had simply been talking. He wrote in his notebook that evening. Calloway uses her medical background to ask precise questions that do not present as precise. Note this technique. Then he drew a short line and wrote, "The food was very good." He considered crossing that out. He left it. The negotiations on the 4th day moved into harder ground. Transit route rights, resource access. The Accord's position on newly charted systems sitting between human-claimed space and Selvari-adjacent territory. These were discussions that took years in standard diplomacy and sometimes found no resolution at all. Ambassador Voss sat across from Oravan, and the terms she presented were, the only accurate word was generous. The Accord's senior trade representative, sitting 2 seats from Oravan, kept reviewing his own notes as if suspecting a translation error. He requested clarification 3 times on the transit rights clause alone. Every time the translation was verified. The humans were offering favorable terms, very favorable terms. The kind of terms offered when wanting something, but Lauren could not locate what they wanted. The kind of terms offered when afraid, but he could not find the fear. The kind of terms offered when the other party possessed something essential. But the Accord's resource inventory was public, and the humans had equivalent or superior access to nearly everything on it. He watched Voss through the afternoon session. She presented the terms without urgency. She answered every question completely. She did not rush. She did not oversell. She occupied her chair the way a mountain occupied a landscape, not through effort, simply through being the shape of the thing. When Oravan pushed back on one clause politely, but firmly, Voss listened to the full objection, paused exactly as long as necessary, and offered a revision that addressed the concern without surrendering anything she had not already planned to surrender. Lauren was watching her face when she offered the revision. Nothing moved in it that she had not chosen to move. He had interviewed 47 sentient species across his career. He had sat across from ambassadors and military commanders and scientists and people in the worst circumstances their lives had produced. He had learned to read faces the way he had learned to read weather, not flawlessly, but well enough to identify when something was being held back. He could not read her face, not because it was empty. It was not empty. It was warm and present and appropriately expressive, and produced all the correct movements at all the correct moments. It was precisely what a face should be doing in this room at this table. That was the difficulty. It was too precisely correct. He wrote in his notebook, "Voss's expressions are contextually exact, correct warmth, correct gravity, correct consideration at correct moments. Either she is a naturally exceptional diplomat or she has complete command of her own face, possibly both. Do not confuse naturalness with the absence of control." He underlined complete command of her own face and looked at it. Then he closed the notebook and paid attention to the session. That night at 3:30 station time, the long-range arrays registered a contact. The technician on duty was a young Selvari named Prith who had worked the night rotation for 2 years and found it peaceful. Very little happened at 3:30. Ships did not generally travel through this region. It was gravitationally inconvenient. Not dangerous but awkward enough that most traffic routed around it. The neutral station sat in genuine isolation out here. That was the purpose of it. The reading came in at the extreme edge of sensor range. Maximum distance, minimum resolution, essentially a mass signal which told you something occupied that space without telling you what. The figure was large, very large, and then it was gone. Prith ran a diagnostic. All systems returned clean. He checked the array calibration. Normal. He looked at the reading for a while and typed into his log, 331, possible contact, mass signal at outer sensor range. No follow-up return. Probable instrument drift or spatial debris. He went back to his other work. In the morning, the duty supervisor reviewed the log entry alongside 17 other items. She flagged it as low priority, assigned it to the equipment maintenance queue, moved on. The entry sat in the queue. Lauren spent the 5th day in the archive. He told himself and told the delegation coordinator who inquired that he was completing standard cultural background research, contextual material, notes a xenobiologist was expected to compile. He accessed the human military history files. They were public, fully public, not restricted, not classified, available to any Accord researcher with a registered access credential. He had the credential. He had not used it for this before because it had not seemed relevant before. He told himself he would read for 1 hour and then return to his behavioral documentation. He was still reading 6 hours later. The numbers were difficult to process, not because they were large. Lauren had studied species with long histories and large populations and understood that large population events produced large numbers. They were difficult to process because of the frequency. Humans had been engaging in large-scale, organized conflicts for as far back as their surviving records reached, not occasionally, not once per civilizational era, continuously. There was not, as far as Lauren could determine, a single century in human recorded history that did not contain multiple simultaneous wars occurring in different parts of their home world. He found this conclusion and checked it 3 times. He had not misread anything. And the weapons. He spent a long time on the weapons, not because he sought them out but because the archive was organized chronologically and weaponry was embedded in every period, because weapons were inseparable from every era, because humanity across every culture and every century had devoted extraordinary creative and intellectual resources to producing more capable weapons, more range, more force, more speed, more effect with less material, and then beyond that. Further beyond that, the industrial transformation of the human home world had within 2 generations moved from producing better agricultural tools to producing weapons capable of killing 10,000 people in a single event. They had used those weapons. Then they had made better ones. Lauren leaned back from his screen and looked at the ceiling for a while. He thought about what he knew of the Selvari, his own people. They had fought wars too. He was not naive enough to believe the Accord had an unmarked history, but the Selvaris' wars were separated by long stretches of peace, long enough that each new conflict arrived as something of a shock, a wound, something the society had to spend generations recovering from. His people had a specific word, untranslatable, approximately describing the feeling of a civilization in the aftermath of major war. The word carried exhaustion and relief, and a collective understanding that this would not happen again for a very long time. He could not find the human equivalent of that word. He searched for an hour. He looked through synonym indexes and emotional vocabulary databases and associated cultural terminology. The closest thing he found was a human word describing the period between wars. The word did not mean peace. It meant peacetime, a period defined by the absence of the other thing rather than by any quality of its own. He turned that over in his mind for a long time. Then he returned to the archive and found the section on the final global human conflict, the last one, the one that ended approximately 120 years before first contact. He read it from beginning to end. The war had killed an enormous number of people. Afterward, the surviving states constructed international institutions, negotiation frameworks, systems for collective cooperation. They had worked very hard to build those institutions well. By most measures, the institutions were genuinely good. And then at the end of the historical entry, there was a line that stopped him completely. Despite the post-conflict institutional framework, humanity continued to maintain substantial military capability across all major political entities through the subsequent century, with global military expenditure remaining at levels consistent with active wartime readiness. He read that sentence again, active wartime readiness, through a century of peace. He pressed his hand flat on the desk, not because he was frightened. He was not frightened. He was a scientist and this was data. He pressed his palm flat on the surface and breathed for a moment and then picked up his notebook and wrote carefully. Question: what does a species at peace look like when it has never fully lowered its readiness for the alternative? He did not write an answer. He did not have one yet. He filed the archive session and went to the evening meal. Kai asked him at dinner whether he had eaten the leftovers from lunch because there were more today and he could bring them to Lauren's office if Lauren wanted. Lauren said yes. He was quiet at dinner, not visibly so. He answered questions. He participated. He laughed at appropriate moments. But internally he was processing in parallel the way he always worked when a research problem had anchored itself in his cognition and refused to move. He watched the humans at the table. He watched Kai, who was teaching a junior Selvari delegate the correct way to hold his water vessel, because Kai had been holding his incorrectly for 4 days, and had finally decided to ask for guidance. He watched Calloway, who was deep in conversation with one of the Selvari cultural specialists about how musical structure varied across species. A discussion that sounded like casual exchange and contained Lauren, now suspected a level of careful listening that was not casual at all. He watched Voss. She was talking with Oravan. They were both smiling. Oravan said something that was probably a joke and Voss laughed, a real laugh, or a perfect reproduction of one. Lauren had genuinely lost the ability to determine which. He thought, she is very accomplished at this. He thought, they are all very accomplished at this. And then he thought something he had been avoiding, which was that being accomplished at being liked was a skill people practiced. And the question of why a person practiced any particular skill led back to what they expected to need it for. He looked at the gifts on the side display. The carved giraffe, a small instrument box that played a brief melody when opened, a sealed container of a human spice the Selvari side had not yet tried but had thanked them for at length. The gifts were genuine. He believed that. He also believed the pilot of that vessel was military trained, and the operations coordinator had located 3 exits before anyone asked her to, and the drill response had looked like a rehearsed tactical deployment, and Voss's hands did not tremble. Both things were true at the same time. He was certain of that. He simply did not yet know what they added up to. On the 6th night it happened again. 2 arrays this time, different approach angles, same outer range zone, same enormous mass signal, and then nothing. The reading held for 11 seconds before it vanished, long enough that 2 technicians both caught it and looked across the monitoring station at each other. One of them cross-referenced the 2 array readings to resolve a position. The object, if it was an object, had been approximately 900,000 kilometers off the station's secondary bearing. 900,000 kilometers was a comfortable distance by any standard measure. It was also well within weapons range for any platform with serious long-range capability. The crosscheck went into a separate incident report. That report was flagged for the morning duty supervisor alongside Prith's entry from 2 nights prior. The morning supervisor had 22 items. She forwarded both reports to the sensor analysis team, which had a 3-day review queue. The reports sat in the queue. Lauren, who did not know any of this, spent the 6th evening doing something he had not planned. He returned to the archive and searched for a specific concept. It took 40 minutes to find the correct search parameters because the idea was structural. The kind of thing you had to already understand to search for correctly. But eventually, he found it. He was looking for the human word or concept for deliberately not revealing what you were capable of. He expected to find it in the diplomatic literature or the negotiation studies. He found it in the military strategy archive. The concept was old, extremely old, one of the oldest documented strategic principles in human record. The idea was simple. Do not allow your opponent to understand the full scope of your capability until the moment you require them to. Present as smaller, present as slower, present as less than you are. Give the other party a picture of you that is comfortable for them to hold, and hold it steady, right until the moment the picture needs to change. The humans had a word for the force that revealed itself at that moment. The word was deterrent. He searched the entry on deterrence theory and read it. 50 minutes later, he closed the screen and sat in the dark of his small office. The entry was not threatening on its own. The theory was not about aggression. It was in its own logic about preventing conflict, about making the cost of attack so obviously catastrophic that no rational party would attempt it. In its own internal framework, it was a form of stability maintenance. The piece that settled in Lauren's chest like cold metal was the final line of the entry. For deterrence to function, the capability must be real. He looked at his notebook. He had written many things across the last 6 days. He read back through them from the first entry: the pilot, the exits, the hands, the drill response, Kai and the water valve, the archive, the old wars, the peacetime military expenditure. He looked at the deterrence entry for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and added one line. Question: if the human delegation aboard this station is a diplomatic team, what is the vessel in Bay 7? He set the pen down. He picked it up again. Follow-up question: if the vessel in Bay 7 is not solely a diplomatic transport, what is present out there in the dark that we cannot detect? He looked at that question. He did not sleep well. The following morning, he pulled the Human Naval Classification Database. Public access. Same availability as the archive. Accessible to any registered Accord researcher because humanity had joined the Accord's information sharing network as one of their very first cooperative gestures. Look at us. Nothing concealed. He searched by vessel class. He searched by displacement figures. He thought about the mass signals from the sensor logs he had never seen, but had been reconstructing from behavior since the first day. He was working backward from observable conduct to probable hardware. The precise docking, the military-trained pilot, the crew that moved through an emergency drill the way people moved when they had rehearsed emergencies many, many times. He built a working estimate of the vessel type that would fit the profile of what he had been observing. Then he searched the database. He got a result. The entry was in the historical archive subsection. 40 years old. The vessel class had been retired. Decommissioned, the file stated approximately 38 years ago following a long service record. He looked at the performance specifications. He looked at the mass figures. He sat completely still. Then he read the mass figures again because sometimes the first pass left room for error and you had to read something a second time to be certain you were reading it correctly. He was reading it correctly. He set his notebook flat on the desk and pressed both palms onto it and looked at the wall. The file was 40 years old, retired class, decommissioned. He looked at the mass estimates he had built from behavioral evidence. There were 6 of them out there. 6. The morning of Day 7 began quietly. Lauren arrived at the research lounge early before the session started. He sat with his notebook and a warm cup of the station's reconstituted coffee, which he had developed a tolerance for across 2 years of posting. He had not written anything new since the previous night. He had been waiting to see whether the feeling stabilized before he committed it to words. Feelings written down too quickly came out wrong. Too sharp. Too certain. Not enough space left for the possibility of a miscalculation. He had not miscalculated. 6 years of field work and 14 years of practical research told him he had not miscalculated. But he was a scientist, and he understood that the distance between very probable and verified was a distance you did not cross without direct evidence. What he had was inference built on behavior built on absence, and that was not the same thing as evidence. He was still sitting with that when Kai came in already carrying his own coffee, and settled into the seat across from Lauren with the ease of someone who had decided they were allowed to do that. "You look like you have been awake since midnight," Kai said. "I have been awake since midnight," Lauren said. Kai nodded, the way you nodded when something confirmed what you had already concluded. "What are you working on?" "Background research," Lauren said. "Cultural material." Kai looked at him across the rim of his cup. "Is it interesting?" Lauren thought about the deterrence entry, the mass figures, the 6 decommissioned vessels that the record said were retired and his calculations said were not. "Very," he said. Kai nodded again. He did not ask what the material was. He talked instead about a Selvari dish he had eaten the previous evening that he was still thinking about, and whether it would be presumptuous to ask the kitchen for the preparation method. Lauren told him it would not be presumptuous at all. That asking for a recipe was in fact considered a compliment. Kai made a note of this on the small personal device he kept in his breast pocket. Lauren watched him make the note. He thought about asking directly, setting one clear question flat on the table the way Voss set her terms. No diplomatic framing, no careful wrapping, simply, "What is out there in the dark off our secondary bearing?" He did not ask. He did not ask because he was not certain, and because the sessions were proceeding well, and because he was a xenobiologist and not a security officer, and because he could not verify his mathematics. And because even if the mathematics were correct, he did not yet know what they meant. And because Kai was sitting across from him looking entirely ordinary and discussing kitchen etiquette. And it was very difficult to hold both versions of this person in the same thought at the same moment. He drank his coffee. The morning session began an hour later. The communication blackout began at 11:42. No warning, no signal degradation, no system error indicator. The station's communication simply stopped. Every channel simultaneously, internal, external, diplomatic, emergency, all of them flat at exactly the same instant. Lauren was in the diplomatic chamber when it happened. He was seated against the rear wall taking notes while Oravan and Voss worked through the 3rd revision of the Transit Rights Clause. The translation system's status indicator in the upper display corner shifted from green to gray. The screen itself remained active. Local systems were still operational, but the network connection marker showing the station's link to the wider accord was gone. There was a brief pause, the kind of silence a room produces when something changes and everyone senses it, but no one has given it a name yet. Then the hull groaned, not a catastrophic sound, not the signature of structural failure, a lower and longer sound, the signature of pressure differential, of something striking the outer shell with force enough to register inside but not enough to breach it. Then another, and from somewhere toward the commercial section a sound that was clearly an impact and clearly harder than the first. The alarm started 4 seconds later. This alarm was not the drill. The Selvari contingent moved fast and badly. Oravan's aide reached for the wrong document case and knocked it to the floor. A junior delegate overturned her chair getting up, and then stood facing the wrong direction before reorienting. The cultural specialist who had frozen during the drill froze again. This time his colleague was not fast enough. Lauren reached across and gripped the man's arm and pulled him toward the door before his legs found their own function again. Lauren was frightened. He knew what being frightened felt like in his body, the pulse frills rising, the chest tightening, the specific narrowing of focus that happened when the situation reduced itself to a single question: where is safe and how do I reach it? He was moving toward the corridor with the junior delegate's arm in his grip and the alarm still running and the translation system still gray, and he was frightened entirely. He was passing through the door when he looked at the human side of the room. They were moving, but they were not moving toward the corridor. They separated the way a hand opens into fingers, each person going a specific direction to a specific position with no visible signal between them. The communications technician went directly to the wall panel and began working it with both hands, not frantically, with the focused economy of someone who had selected a task and was executing it. The operations coordinator moved to the main door and positioned herself in the frame. Not blocking, counting. She was confirming that everyone was getting out. Calloway had her medical kit open before Lauren cleared the threshold. She had not needed to locate it in her bag. She knew exactly where it was to the centimeter. Kai was already gone. Lauren looked and could not find him. Then he found him, ahead of the group, already at the junction where the secondary corridor met the primary evacuation route, standing there directing Selvari staff through a path that did not appear on any emergency diagram Lauren had reviewed during his station orientation 2 years ago. Kai was not guessing. He was not reading signs. He knew the route. Lauren ran to stay with the group. As he ran, he thought, when did he learn that? The station's emergency broadcast returned 6 minutes after the blackout ended. The communications technician had done something to the wall panel that Lauren did not understand and likely would not understand if asked to explain it. The internal system came back online, not the external network, only internal, and the announcement told them what they had already begun to understand. The Drevathi. They had come in through the gravitationally inconvenient approach corridor, the navigational awkward zone that traffic avoided. They had struck the commercial section's outer structure with a focused pulse weapon that damaged the hull without fully breaching it. A warning, delivered in Drevathi tactical language. The Drevathi were precise about their warnings. The next one would not be a warning. The Drevathi compact was not a major power. They occupied the middle tier and understood their position, which was why they had invested 30 years in one specific capability: fast and overwhelming initial strikes against targets that could not absorb a sustained engagement. They had executed this approach 4 times. They had prevailed each time. The Accord had responded each time with diplomatic communication and economic pressure, which was the Accord's standard response, and which the Drevathi had absorbed without visible difficulty. They did not want a human diplomatic partnership to exist. This was in Drevathi terms a statement of position. The main group assembled in the station's emergency muster point, a reinforced central hub with its own life support designed to maintain 200 people for 72 hours. Lauren counted as they arrived: 43 Selvari staff and delegates, 9 humans, all 9. He counted twice. All 9 were present. He could not reconstruct exactly how all 9 had arrived without a single absence. He had been present during the movement from the diplomatic chamber, and he had still not fully tracked it. The humans had been distributed throughout the evacuation and were now all accounted for, not one missing. Oravan was containing himself. He was an experienced senior delegate and he was managing very well, but his pulse frills were fully elevated and the color in them was wrong. The pale, rapid flutter that Lauren associated with deep systemic stress. Oravan was standing very straight and breathing carefully and doing all the things a skilled diplomat did when circumstances required him to appear composed. Lauren looked at Voss. She was standing 3 meters from Oravan. She was listening to something through her earpiece. Her eyes were moving steadily across the muster point's entry corridor. Her hands were at her sides, still, not rigid, not clenched, simply still. She looked like someone waiting for a delayed transport. The thought arrived in Lauren's mind as absurd, and he held it anyway because it was the most accurate description he had. Everyone else in the room looked exactly like what they were. People dealing with an emergency aboard a station under attack. She looked like someone in the vicinity of a mild inconvenience waiting for it to pass. And then he watched something shift in her, not in her face, not in her posture, something deeper than those things. Some internal threshold reached, some decision finalized. She raised one hand and touched her earpiece once. She looked at the operations coordinator. One nod, so brief Lauren nearly missed it. The operations coordinator turned to Kai and spoke very quietly near his ear. Kai set his coffee on the floor beside him. He had somehow still been holding his coffee. He straightened. The Drevathi boarding team came through the outer breach in the commercial section and reached the diplomatic area in under 8 minutes. 8 minutes was fast for a boarding action on a station this configuration. The Drevathi were practiced at this. They had done it before. 8 soldiers in full tactical arrangement moving in pairs. No unnecessary sound. Professional. Efficient. Carrying the confidence of people who had performed a specific action enough times to know exactly how it ended. The first pair came around the corner of the main corridor at a run and stopped. The corridor was empty. They moved forward. 2 more corners. 2 more empty corridors. They reached the junction outside the diplomatic chamber, and the remaining 4 caught up, and they consolidated and moved toward the muster point access corridor. And that was where the 2 humans were standing. Just 2. Lauren was not in the corridor. He was inside the muster point watching through the access frame alongside about 15 others who had positioned themselves where they had sightlines without being visible themselves. He was not entirely sure how that positioning had been arranged. The operations coordinator had said something general about viewing angles, and everyone had moved. He had moved with them. So he saw it, or the majority of it. What he saw: 8 Drevathi soldiers in full tactical configuration, entering a corridor where 2 humans were standing. What he saw: both humans were unarmed, as far as he could assess. What he saw: the first 4 soldiers moved forward and the 2 humans moved. And then there was a period of approximately 4 seconds that he could not process fully in real time, because his eyes were not built to track at that speed. What he saw next: 4 of the 8 soldiers were on the floor. The other 4 had not cleared the threshold. The 2 humans were standing in the corridor. One had a small cut above his eye. The other was examining her sleeve, which had torn. She looked at the tear with what appeared to be mild irritation. Then she looked up. Her eyes moved through the corridor the way eyes move through a space when assessing what required attention next. Lauren stood in the access frame of the muster point and looked at the 4 soldiers on the floor. He looked at the 2 humans. He looked at the 4 seconds that had just occurred in the space where 8 soldiers had been standing. He could not make the mathematics of it work, not the physical mathematics. He understood in abstract terms that human beings possessed extensive combat conditioning built into their military and paramilitary structures. That close quarters engagement was a documented human capability extending back tens of thousands of years. That positional surprise and corridor geometry were significant tactical variables. That 4 seconds was sufficient time for a great many things to happen when you knew precisely what you were doing. He understood all of that. He still could not make the mathematics work. Oravan was making calls. The external network was still down, but the internal system was operational, and he was coordinating with the station commander, who was coordinating with engineering, who was working to restore external communications. The language in the muster point was rapid and overlapping, and everyone had something to do. Lauren was positioned against the wall doing nothing because there was nothing in his professional capacity to do. He was watching Voss. She had moved to the far corner of the muster point. She was using her encrypted personal channel, the same one she had used to send the 2-word message on the first evening. She was speaking very quietly and he could not make out the words. He watched her face while she spoke. Her face did the correct things: attentive, processing, a small nod, another small nod, and then something that was almost a reaction, the smallest possible shift in the area around her eyes. something a person who was not watching very carefully would not see. It was present for perhaps half a second. Then it was gone and her face returned to its exact register. He did not know what that half-second meant. He did not know if it was good or bad or something else entirely. He only knew it had happened, and that it was the first time across 7 days he had seen something appear in that face that seemed to have arrived from inside it rather than been placed there. She finished her call. She stood in the corner briefly. Then she walked across the muster point and stopped in front of Oravan and said in a voice calibrated to calm that was itself slightly alarming, "Senior Delegate, the Dravathi fleet is completing its strike formation. I want you to know that we are aware of this situation and it is being managed." Oravan looked at her. "Who is we?" he said. She looked at him steadily, the way a person looked when deciding what portion of the answer to give. "We," she said, and she moved past him to stand before the muster point's forward display, which was showing the external sensor feed, which was showing the Dravathi fleet arranging itself into the configuration that Lauren recognized from the military history archive as a second strike envelope. 12 vessels against a station with shields at 40% and no combat-rated response within range. Lauren looked at the display. He looked at Voss standing before it. He thought about the file that was 40 years old, retired class, decommissioned, and then he thought, there were 6 of them out there. He stood in the muster point and watched the display and waited. The room was loud with everyone's fear except for one section of it where the 9 humans stood in a loose group watching the same feed. Quiet, still, and Kai, who made everyone laugh, who had told him about giraffes, who had stood at a junction in the secondary corridor and directed civilians through a route he had memorized before anyone asked him to. Kai was standing with his arms crossed and his eyes on the figures on the display. And his face was, Lauren recognized it now, the face of someone who was not afraid of what was approaching, not through courage, not through disciplined suppression of fear, simply not afraid, as if what was coming was not unexpected, as if it had in some way Lauren did not yet have the right language for already been resolved. Ambassador Voss stood before the display with her hands at her sides and said nothing further to anyone. Her hands did not move. Outside in the dark, the Dravathi fleet completed its formation. The station's shields held at 40%. Lauren looked at all of it and felt the shape of something he could not yet name pressing against the inside of his understanding like something very large leaning against a door. He would know what was on the other side of that door very soon. He was not ready. He watched Voss's hands. They were still. The Dravathi fleet commander transmitted the surrender demand at 12:31 station time. It came through on a broad, open channel, not directed at anyone specifically, directed at everything simultaneously. The way a demand was transmitted when the sender was sufficiently confident in the outcome that the particular recipient was irrelevant. The translation system rendered it cleanly because the Dravathi did not work in subtlety. The message read, "You have 60 seconds to signal compliance, after which we will initiate full structural engagement against the station." It carried the tone of a message sent by someone who had delivered this same communication 4 times previously and found the process unremarkable. The station commander's voice came immediately over the internal channel. She told everyone in the muster point to hold position. She told them the shield systems were maintaining. She told them a response was being prepared. She did not specify what form. Lauren was counting. Not the 60 seconds. He was counting the Dravathi vessels on the display, 12 arranged in what the military history archive called a containment envelope. He had looked up that term 2 days ago without knowing why. He understood why now. A containment envelope was designed to prevent departure from the enclosed target and to ensure complete strike coverage. It was the formation used when you were certain nothing was coming to assist the thing you were attacking. 40 seconds. He looked at the humans, unchanged, no visible shift. Kai had acquired someone else's coffee and was holding it with both hands. It was the wrong color, not his. Calloway had her medical kit closed at her feet. The operations coordinator was reading the display with the flat, focused expression of someone reviewing a document that confirmed what a previous document had already established. 30 seconds. Oravan moved to stand beside Lauren. He said nothing. He looked at the display and then at the humans and then back at the display. His pulse frills were still elevated, but the coloring had changed. The rapid pale flutter of deep systemic stress had shifted into something slower, not calm but adjacent to it. The coloring of a person who has decided that fear is no longer the most productive state available. 20 seconds. Voss had not moved from her position before the display. She was reading the Drevathi formation with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving steadily across the figures. She looked, Lauren thought, like someone watching a clock, not anxious, not resigned, simply observing, the way you watched something whose behavior you had anticipated and were now waiting to see confirm itself. 10 seconds. The room went very quiet, not the quiet of calm, the quiet of everyone holding their breath in the same direction at the same moment, which was a different thing entirely. The 60 seconds expired. Nothing happened. For 3 full seconds after the demand lapsed, nothing happened. And in those 3 seconds, Lauren experienced something specific. The precise disorientation of a moment that has not matched its own logic. The Drevathi were not known for patience past their own stated timelines. They had not waited before. Then something appeared on the long-range sensors. Not one vessel. The display updated in the way displays updated when they were processing significantly more information than they were designed to receive simultaneously. A brief lag while the system resolved the data. Then everything at once. The mass returns came in as displacement figures first, the way they always did at range. And the numbers populated across the screen one after another, and Lauren watched them arrive, and felt the room change around him as everyone else watched them arrive. 6 contacts, already inside the Drevathi formation's perimeter, already within weapons range, not the long-distance threshold, the close engagement band where targeting precision improved and response windows shortened, and the geometry of the encounter tilted decisively toward whoever had arrived first. They had not been traveling toward the station. They had not been responding and closing from distance. They were already there, already inside the envelope. Which meant they had positioned themselves before the envelope was formed, before the Drevathi completed their approach, possibly before the strike against the commercial section, possibly. And this was the thought Lauren held at arm's length and examined very carefully, possibly before the diplomatic sessions had ever begun. Oravan said something quietly beside him in Old Selvari, that the translation system did not render, but that required no translation. The Drevathi commander sent a second transmission, much shorter than the first. It asked in language that had shed its earlier certainty for identification of the new contacts. No one answered. The 6 contacts decloaked, not simultaneously, in sequence, one after another, which Lauren would understand later was a deliberate choice. Each vessel materializing on the display at a measured interval that gave the Drevathi sensors enough time to fully process each one before the next appeared. It was, he recognized, almost instructional. Here is the first one, now here is the next, now another, take your time, understand what you are looking at. 5 escort vessels came first. They were large. Not the largest classification Lauren had encountered in Accord records, but large enough that the Drevathi containment envelope, which had appeared solid 30 seconds ago, now resembled a structure drawn in loose material. Each escort was running full active sensor broadcast, not passive observation, full active, announcing its presence loudly and completely, which in naval practice was the equivalent of rising to full height in a room and ensuring everyone had seen your face. The Drevathi commander sent another transmission, shorter still. Then the 6th vessel came. It came last and came slowly, which was also a choice because nothing of that displacement moved slowly by chance. The mass figures populated on the display, and the system took longer than standard to process them because the station's sensors had not been calibrated for something of that weight in this region and ran their verification sequence twice before committing to the numbers. The numbers were very large. Lauren had seen those numbers before, in the archive, 40 years ago. In a file marked retired, decommissioned, historical record only, he had matched them to his behavioral calculations 2 nights ago in his office. He had sat with his palm on the desk and breathed. He stopped breathing now. The warship came out of concealment the way a geological formation would come out of concealment if geological formations could move. Not dramatically, not with effort, simply present in the way that very large and very certain things were present. It positioned itself at the center of the Dreadnought formation, with the geometry of something that had selected this exact coordinate and found it satisfactory. The Dreadnought commander's transmission came 14 seconds later, 3 words. The translation system rendered them as, "What is that?" Nobody on the human side answered that either. Lauren watched the display. He watched the Dreadnought formation, which had been a containment envelope 60 seconds ago and was now 12 vessels discovering that the thing they had enclosed had associates. He watched the escort vessels hold position. He watched the immense warship sit at the center of it all like a fact, not threatening, not performing, simply present in the manner that facts were present, which was completely and without accommodation. He thought about the displacement figures, the hull classifications, the weapons ratings, the engagement range specifications he had read in the archive. He thought about what those specifications represented against 12 Dreadnought vessels arranged for a station and not for this. He thought about the word deterrence. For deterrence to function, the capability must be real. The Dreadnought commander sent one more transmission, the longest since the surrender demand. It covered in rapidly assembled diplomatic language the Dreadnought compact's position that the situation had arisen from a misunderstanding, that there was no hostile intent toward the station or its occupants, that the compact was prepared to open communications toward a peaceful resolution, that the earlier structural contact had been an expression of concern about the pace of negotiations and not an act of aggression, that the compact looked forward to a constructive. The warship fired twice. The first discharge crossed the distance to its target in the kind of time that made distance irrelevant. The second followed before the first had resolved, both precisely placed, not at the Dreadnought vessels closest to the station, not at the ones presenting the most immediate threat, at the 2 vessels anchoring the formation's withdrawal corridors, the 2 vessels whose continued presence made organized departure difficult for the remaining 10. They were no longer in position. The Dreadnought formation fragmented. What followed was not a battle in the sense Lauren understood battles from the archive, not an exchange, not 2 sides pressing against each other with losses accumulating on both. It was something else, something that did not carry a clean word in Selvari or in Accord's standard diplomatic vocabulary. The escort vessels moved, and the Dreadnought vessels moved, and the warship moved very little, and it continued for 9 minutes and 40 seconds by the station's internal clock, which Lauren watched in the corner of the display the entire time. At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, the Dreadnought fleet was no longer a formation. It had ceased in any practical sense relevant to this situation to be a fleet. The muster point was very loud afterward. Relief was a physical substance in a room when it arrived, a sound and a pressure shift, and a collective exhale that felt like the station itself releasing a breath it had been holding. People were talking, several at once, some to no one in particular. Oravan had a hand on the shoulder of a junior delegate who looked as though she might sit down without warning. The cultural specialist who kept freezing in emergencies was not frozen. He was speaking quickly and gesturing broadly, and telling the story of the previous 9 minutes to anyone who would stay still long enough to listen, already arranging it into a shape comfortable to carry. Lauren was not listening to any of it. He had pulled the crew monitoring feeds. They were not classified. The diplomatic access package all delegation members received included monitoring access to non-sensitive crew communications on affiliated vessels, a transparency measure, something the humans had offered as part of the access framework. Look at us. Nothing concealed. Here is what our crews are doing. He had accessed the feed before he consciously decided to. His hands had moved before the thought finished forming. He watched the escort crews first. Post-engagement assessment, position confirmation, sensor sweeps, the methodical process of a crew working through what had just occurred and determining what was required next. Efficient, professional, competent in the way that came from training something long enough that it became reflex rather than skill. He watched them for what he expected to find. Relief, the released tension that came after a hard thing survived. The laughter of people who had been afraid and were no longer afraid. Not celebration necessarily, but that specific exhale. The moment when the body finished processing the adrenaline and arrived briefly at the other side. He watched, he changed the feed to the warship. He watched the warship crew. He sat very still. They were working, simply working. Systematic, methodical, task to task, damage assessment, checking their own systems. Though the warship had not taken a hit, you checked your systems anyway because that was what you did after an engagement. That was the procedure: debris tracking, position logging, compiling the post-action report for the command chain. One technician was running a calibration cycle on a sensor array that had performed without error. Running it again because the procedure specified running it again. A young weapons officer, young enough that Lauren could see his face and estimate his age as no more than 25 by human developmental standards, was sitting at his station eating a meal, a real meal, a heated meal in a proper container, not a field ration, and he was eating it with genuine attention, the manner of someone consuming something they were actually enjoying. He was not relieved. He was not relieved because he had not been afraid. None of them had been afraid. Lauren closed the feed. He sat in the noise of the muster point and the relief and the voices. He sat completely still in the middle of all of it, and he thought. He thought about the gifts, the wrapped packages with ribbon, the carved giraffe that had taken 3 weeks, the small music box. He thought about Kai and the translation jokes and the 15 minutes by the water valve and the giraffes and how easy it was to like him. He thought about that corridor junction and the routes Kai had committed to memory without being asked. He thought about Calloway's precise questions that did not present as precise. He thought about the operations coordinator and the 3 exits. He thought about the drill, the hands, the 40 years of peacetime military expenditure. He thought about the deterrence entry and the capability must be real, and the archive full of old songs with their body counts that children sang in cheerful groups. He thought about 9 minutes and 40 seconds. He thought about the weapons officer eating his meal. He thought about the word that sat underneath all of it, the word he had been circling for 7 days without landing on, and he landed on it now, and it was not a comfortable landing. They were never afraid, not brave, not conditioned past fear, not disciplined enough to appear calm while experiencing something else. Never afraid because what was coming was not a surprise, because the Dravathi making their move, the strike on the commercial section, the fleet arrangement, the surrender demand, the countdown, all of it was from the human perspective, not an emergency. It was an anticipated outcome. One they had prepared for and positioned against before the first diplomatic session had ever convened. Before the station's security assessments had flagged the threat. Before the Accord had any awareness the Dravathi were moving. The gifts were genuine. The warmth was genuine. Kai's humor was genuine. Calloway's curiosity was genuine. Voss's patient, careful diplomacy was genuine. And 6 vessels had been sitting in concealment outside sensor range since before any of it started. Both things were true simultaneously, and Lauren sat with both of them and felt the shape of a reclassification happening inside his understanding. Not sudden, not violent, more like something very large and very slow settling into a new position, taking the surrounding landscape with it. We were never, he thought, the ones who needed protecting at this table. Voss was standing before the display again. The display was quieter now. The Drevathi fleet was gone in any formation sense. The 6 human vessels were holding position. The station's shields were still at 40%, but the reason to care about that number had fundamentally changed. Oravan walked to her. Lauren watched from across the room. He could not hear the exchange. He could read the posture on both sides. Oravan asking something, Voss answering. Oravan asking again with slightly modified body language. Voss responding briefly and levelly. 3 minutes. Oravan returned to stand beside Lauren. She says they will hold position until we confirm the station is fully secured. Oravan said. Then they will return to their assigned stations. Lauren looked at him. Their assigned stations. Oravan met his eyes. Yes. They both looked at the display. The warship sat in the dark outside the station, patient, vast, not moving until it had determined things were sufficiently resolved to allow movement. Did you know? Lauren said. Oravan was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Lauren nodded. He went back to his notebook. He found the low-priority entry, the one about the hands, written on the second day and filed without escalation because he could not name what he was looking at with enough certainty to assign it a classification. He had written, possible baseline variation or extreme conditioning, monitor and reassess. He looked at it for a while. Then he found the priority field. He changed the designation from low priority to critical. He looked at the original timestamp. Second day, 14 hours into the sessions. He was 47 hours too late for the report to have influenced anything. The situation had resolved without him, without his documentation, without anything he had done or failed to do changing the outcome. He filed it anyway, because it was the correct record to have, because the correct record was the honest one, because somewhere in some future analysis of this week, his notation about a diplomat's hands that did not tremble during an emergency drill was going to be a useful data point for someone who needed to understand what they were dealing with. He put his notebook in his bag. Across the muster point Kai had found a full cup of coffee, his own this time, and was drinking it with the composed expression of a man whose morning had not unfolded exactly as intended, but who was fundamentally undisturbed by mornings that did not unfold as intended. Lauren looked at him. He thought about what he now understood and what that understanding felt like positioned inside his chest. He thought about the corridor and the 4 seconds and the weapons officer's meal. He thought about the warship outside, sitting in the dark, patient, certain, real. He thought about dinner. He thought deliberately and with full awareness of everything. He had just comprehended that it was important to remain warm. Specifically and deliberately, it was important to remain warm. He crossed the room. Kai, he said. Kai looked at him. Would you want to get dinner tonight? Lauren said, after all of this is settled. Kai looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, not quite, more like the recognition of a question that carried more than one layer. Yeah, he said, absolutely. He smiled. It was a genuine smile. Lauren was certain of that. He was also certain it was a choice. Both things were true. He was learning to hold both things at once. The station took 3 days to fully stabilize, not structurally. The damage to the commercial section was significant but clean. The variety of damage engineers understood and could plan around. The repair teams had a timeline within 6 hours of the attack. The station's essential structure was sound. What took 3 days was everything else. The communications backlog, the security reviews. The formal incident reports that every department was required to file in triplicate because that was what the accord required following an event of this designation. And the event had a designation now, and the designation required documentation, and the documentation required time. The Drevathi Compact sent a communication on the second day. It arrived through an intermediary channel, which was the correct approach when you had just had 12 of your vessels removed from a tactical formation by something you had not known existed and needed to say something official while still determining the appropriate register. The communication expressed regret for the incident. It described the events as arising from a miscalculation of the regional security environment. It used the word miscalculation 4 times in 6 paragraphs, which Lauren thought was either thorough or compulsive, and was not certain which. The communication did not reference the warship. It did not mention the human vessels at all. It was the communication of a party that had learned something significant and was hoping the learning did not require direct discussion. The human vessels held position for 31 hours after the engagement. Then one by one the escorts shifted, not departing, repositioning, settling into a wider pattern around the station like coordinates on a perimeter that also happened to be navigational reference points. The warship moved last and moved least, a few thousand kilometers to a position that the sensor team mapped and then examined for a long time without speaking. The position placed the warship between the station and the direction the Dreadnought had approached from. It was a very simple geometry. Lauren noted it in his records under the heading Positioning Post-Engagement, and then looked at the heading for a while before deciding it was accurate enough to keep. He slept properly on the second night. He had not anticipated that. He lay down and expected to be awake for hours the way he had been awake for hours every night since the sessions began. Instead, he was asleep within minutes and did not wake until morning, which was its own category of information. He thought about what it meant that the presence of an enormous warship positioned between him and the people who had just attempted to destroy his station was the thing that allowed him to sleep. He thought about that for a while. He did not write it down. Some things were simply true and did not need to be a record entry. Dinner with Kai on the first evening after the attack was quiet and easy in a way that surprised Lauren, though afterward he thought perhaps it should not have. They ate in the station's small crew canteen. The main dining facilities were in the commercial section still under repair. The food was simple. The lighting was not generous. There were repair crews in the outer corridor making the sounds repair crews made. It was not a formal meal. It was not staged or managed. Kai talked about the vessel he had arrived on. Not technically, not in terms that approached anything classified, simply the way you talked about a place where you had spent a significant portion of your time. He talked about the bunk arrangement and the specific sound the ventilation system made at 200, and a cook named Varka who produced something from root vegetables that Kai described as genuinely life-altering. He talked about a crew member who had recently gotten married, and how the entire deck had spent 6 hours negotiating over a collective gift, because 20 people in extended close proximity developed very firm opinions about appropriate presents. He talked about the giraffe. The craftsman was his uncle. It had taken 3 weeks, and his uncle had communicated his frustrations about the neck every single day of those 3 weeks, because the neck was technically extremely demanding in that particular wood grain, and his uncle had called Kai twice in the middle of the night to discuss the neck specifically. Did he resolve it? Lauren asked. He resolved it, Kai said. He always resolves it. He requires the complaint phase first. Lauren thought about the carving on the side display in the diplomatic chamber, the grain of the wood moving with the shape of the animal's body. Tell him it is beautiful, Lauren said. Kai smiled. I will. They did not discuss the corridor. They did not discuss the 4 seconds. They did not discuss the warship or the 9 minutes and 40 seconds or the weapons officer's meal or any of the things Lauren had been turning over for 2 days. He considered raising it 3 times and did not, partly because he was not certain how to frame the question, partly because the food was good and the exchange was easy. And there was a version of this dinner that was simply 2 people eating in a damaged station after a difficult week, and he found to his own quiet surprise that he wanted that version. He wanted to sit across from someone and eat food and discuss nothing complicated for an hour. Kai appeared to want the same, or reproduced wanting the same with complete accuracy. Lauren decided finishing his second helping of something made from a Selvari grain that paired unexpectedly well with a human spice Calloway had produced from somewhere unspecified, that both of those were probably true simultaneously, and that being able to hold both of them without it diminishing the dinner was in fact the correct response. Both things were true. The dinner was good. The emergency session of the Accord convened on the fourth day. All senior delegates were present. Several who had not been on the station attended via secure transmission, their faces in small panels along the hall's perimeter, some visibly at the end of a rushed authorization process to connect in time. The chamber was more occupied than it had been at any point during the negotiations. Everyone had something to say about what had happened, and most of them were saying it simultaneously in the precession period, until Oravan's aide activated the priority signals, and the room settled toward something resembling order. Lauren sat in his usual position against the rear wall. The human delegation occupied their side of the table, 9 people, same as day one, Voss at the center, the same composed arrangement, the same quiet readiness that Lauren had spent 7 days learning to read accurately. He looked at them and thought about who they had been in his understanding on the first day and who they were in his understanding now. The distance between those two positions was not comfortable. He was not attempting to make it comfortable. Comfortable was not the objective. Accurate was the objective. The session opened with a formal statement from the Accord's senior mediator, a very old Selvari named Thavorn, who had been facilitating interstellar disputes for longer than some current member species had maintained a spacefaring civilization. He spoke with the precision of someone who selected each word the way an engineer selected a load-bearing element, not for elegance but for function. He said the events of 3 days prior had clarified certain questions the Accord had been evaluating for some time regarding the nature of a formal partnership with humanity. He said the Accord owed the human delegation and the human vessels that had intervened an acknowledgement that fell outside the range of standard diplomatic language. He said what had happened to this station and what had not happened to this station were both directly attributable to the presence of that delegation and those vessels. He said he would open the floor to the motion for full partnership status. The motion was offered before he finished the sentence. The second was immediate. The vote was called. It was unanimous before the count was complete. Members were signaling affirmation ahead of their designated turns, which was technically procedurally irregular, and Thavorn permitted without comment, which was itself a comment. Even the 2 members who had consistently abstained from preliminary partnership discussions across 3 years of pre-contact negotiations voted in favor. One of them said very quietly into a microphone she may not have realized was still active, "There is no useful alternative." Lauren heard that. He wrote it in his notebook. He looked at it. There is no useful alternative. He set his pen down and looked at the vote result on the main display and thought about how a room containing some of the most practiced diplomats in the Accord had reached a unanimous decision in under 4 minutes. And whether that was wisdom or something that resembled wisdom from the outside, but was a different thing when examined directly. He thought it was probably both. He was growing accustomed to things being both. Voss spoke after the vote. She thanked the Accord with language that was gracious without excess. She spoke about the value of cooperation across species lines, about shared investment in stable transit corridors, about the sustained work of building trust between peoples who were new to each other, and the importance of patience in that process. She said humanity looked forward to a long and productive partnership. She said this in a voice that was warm and genuine and precisely calibrated. Every word true. And Lauren heard all of it and believed all of it and also sat very still and listened to the specific quality of a person who understood exactly what each syllable was doing. He waited until the formal session ended and the room shifted into the informal reception period. Drinks, small food, the variety of exchange that was personal and unrecorded and where a significant portion of the actual work happened. Then he crossed the room. She tracked him from about 4 meters. He was certain of it. She adjusted her position fractionally so they were at a slight remove from the nearest cluster, just enough space to hold a conversation without being heard by others. She did this without making the adjustment visible. He stood before her. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, without diplomatic framing. "All right," she said. "How long were your vessels out there," he said, "before we invited you here?" She looked at him, not the careful composure, not the precisely calibrated warmth. She simply looked at him, and it was a real look. He felt the weight of it. She was making a decision. He waited. The half-second came and went. That same brief presence of something arriving from inside rather than being placed there. Then it resolved and her face found its usual register. Not quite the formal warmth. Something closer to the expression people carried when being honest. And being honest was not simple. "We came in peace. Xenobiologist Lauren," she said, "we always come in peace first." He looked at her, she looked back. She did not answer the question. She would not answer the question. But standing before her, he understood that she was not evading it. She had answered it in the grammar of what she said, in the specific weight of the word first, in the pause before it and the steadiness after. She had answered it completely. He only had to be willing to receive it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She turned back toward Oravan, who was waiting to speak with her. Lauren watched her go. He returned to his office that evening. He did not open the archive. He did not read anything. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook to a clean page and held his pen and looked at the empty space. He had a report to write, not the escalated entry, the final one. The xenobiological behavioral assessment that was the formal deliverable of his assignment. Observations, analysis, conclusions, recommendations. The document that would enter the Accord's research record and be cited by other researchers and read by policy staff who needed to understand what humanity was. He sat with the blank page. He thought about how to describe them. He thought about the gifts first, the carved giraffe, the music box, the careful wrapping and the ribbon. He thought about how the warmth was real. He was going to say that clearly and without qualification because it was true and a document built on truth required it. The warmth was real. The curiosity was real. Kai's humor was real. Calloway's interest in Selvari biochemistry was real. Voss's patient diplomacy was real. These were not manufactured. He would commit his professional record to that claim, and had implicitly by eating their food and laughing at their observations and sitting across from them for 8 days. He thought about the pilot and the exits and the drill and the hands. He thought about the cultural archive and the old songs and the museums full of preserved instruments of harm visited on leisure days. He thought about the deterrence entry. The capability must be real. He thought about the warship. He thought about the weapons officer eating his meal. He picked up his pen. He wrote for 2 hours, carefully and specifically with the discipline of a researcher who understood that the document being produced would be read by people who had not been in this room, who had not watched these hands, who had not eaten that food, and who needed language to do the work that direct experience could not do for them. He wrote about behavioral indicators and threat response patterns and cultural archive analysis. He wrote about cooperative signaling and its consistency across all observed interactions. He wrote about the gap between surface presentation and demonstrated capability. He was precise with his language in that section, careful not to characterize it as deception when it was not deception. It was simply the difference between what a person showed you and what a person was. All species had that gap. The only question was always one of degree. He wrote about the degree. He wrote about 9 minutes and 40 seconds. He looked at what he had written. He went to the top of the document where the classification field sat. He had typed the word civilization in the subject classification field when he created the document on the first day, because that was the standard term used in a first contact xenobiological report. It was the correct term, defined in the Accord's research protocol, used consistently across 42 prior first contact assessments. He looked at it, he highlighted it, he deleted it, he typed 2 words. He looked at those two words for a long time, then he saved the document. He closed his notebook. Outside the station in the dark between the two star systems, the human vessels held their positions. The warship sat between the station and the direction the Drevathi had come from, patient, enormous, completely still. The way very certain things were still. Its running lights were on, not the full active array, not the sensor broadcast, just the ordinary markers that any vessel maintained in the dark to indicate its presence. A courtesy, a simple signal, I am here. In the diplomatic chamber, the carved giraffe sat on the side display under a small spotlight. The wood caught the light along its grain the way the craftsman had intended. The animal's long neck rising out of the material as if it had always been there waiting only to be uncovered. The music box sat beside it, closed. The spice container had been opened by one of the Selvari kitchen staff who had asked about it and been encouraged to try. The dish they produced with it had been served at the post-vote reception and consumed entirely, which was the kind of small thing that happened during a historic week and went largely unnoticed, and was in its own way exactly as meaningful as anything else that had occurred. Lauren locked his office and walked to the canteen. Kai was already there. He had a coffee and a second cup waiting on the far side of the table. He was reading something on a small personal screen that he put away when Lauren sat down. "How did the report go?" Kai said. Lauren looked at him. "Long," he said. Kai nodded, hungry. "Yes." They ordered. The food came. It was simple and warm and good. They talked about nothing difficult, about the giraffe and the uncle and the complicated neck, about a Selvari dish Kai had been thinking about since the first time he tried it and wanted to know if the kitchen could prepare again, about the music box which Lauren had finally opened that afternoon and which played 7 bars of something old and simple that he had not been able to identify and had decided to look up later. Lauren did not raise the report. He did not mention the warship or the classification field or the 2 words he had typed. He ate his food and drank the coffee, which was substantially better than the station's standard reconstituted version, because Kai had sourced it from somewhere aboard the human vessel that he remained vague about. And it was genuinely excellent coffee. Lauren drank it and thought that this was the correct response, not because he had concluded the other things did not matter. They mattered completely and permanently, and in ways the Accord was going to be working through for a long time. But the correct response to that was not to treat the coffee differently. The coffee was good. The meal was good. Kai was here and the giraffe was on the table in the diplomatic chamber, and the warmth was real. All of those things were true. The 2 words in the classification field were also true. He was learning to hold all of it at once. It became slightly less difficult every hour he practiced it, for reasons that were now completely clear to him, and that made the practice feel like the most important work he had ever undertaken. The report entered the Accord Xenobiological Research Database 3 weeks later under standard access, available to any registered researcher. Most readers engaged primarily with the behavioral analysis section and the cultural archive cross-references. A few noted the deterrence theory discussion. One senior policy researcher produced a response paper citing the drill response observations as the most practically applicable portion of the document. Almost no one noticed the classification field. The 2 words sat at the top of the document in the same small type as every other administrative entry: date, author, assignment number, status, subject classification. Most readers passed over administrative fields quickly and without particular attention. One researcher noticed. She was a young Selvari academic focusing on first contact methodology, writing a thesis on the gap between pre-contact expectation and post-contact assessment. She was reading the report for its analytical approach when she reached the document header and reviewed the fields to verify the classification category. She stopped. She read the 2 words. She read the entire report again from the first line, then read it a 3rd time. Then sat at her desk for a long time looking at the 2 words at the top of the page. Then she sent Lauren a message asking whether he was available to discuss his methodology. He replied within an hour. He said yes. He said he would be glad to discuss it. He said bring your questions. Subject classification. If the story of Quelrath Station left something pressing against the inside of your chest the way it pressed against Lauren's understanding, then you already know why stories like this one matter. The universe is full of doors we have not yet opened and questions we have not yet found the right words for. If you want to be here when the next one arrives, then hit the like button right now and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss what comes next. Every story we tell is one more data point in an archive worth keeping. Do not let the next one find you absent.